She thought the divorce would finally bring peace. After years of quiet endurance, after years of being mocked, dismissed, and treated as if her worth didn't matter, today was supposed to be the end. But as he signed the papers, he didn't just sign with a pen, he signed with a smirk. He mocked her very existence, and in that cold courtroom, laughter seemed to echo louder than justice. Yet what no one expected was that the same table holding those divorce documents would also hold the truth. A truth hidden in her father's will, a truth that could turn humiliation into power, and silence into a voice too strong to ignore. This wasn't just about divorce. This was about dignity, about what it means to strip someone down because of the color of their skin, and about what happens when those who laugh too soon forget that justice has its own timing. So what did the judge uncover that day, and how did it change everything for the woman they thought had nothing? It began like any other morning. She rose quietly, the sun just brushing the curtains of her small but neatly kept home. For years, she had carried the weight of responsibility alone, managing the household, holding down steady work, and caring for those who depended on her. Her life was not extravagant, but it was honest, and it was hers. Every day, she moved through a world that often reminded her she was seen as less worthy, less deserving, less respected. Yet she carried herself with grace, never letting the whispers of prejudice steal her dignity. Neighbors knew her as hardworking, her friends admired her resilience, but behind the calm strength was a woman who had endured far more than most could bear. Her marriage had once promised stability, perhaps even love. But what began with vows and hope had turned into years of silent battles, dismissive glances, cutting remarks, and an unshakable feeling of being treated as though she were invisible. The papers on the judge's desk were supposed to mark an ending, a quiet release from years of disrespect. What she didn't know was that this ending would uncover a secret beginning. And what lay hidden in her father's will would not just change her future, it would expose a truth that no amount of cruelty could erase. The courtroom was supposed to be a place of order, of fairness, of dignity. But for her, it had become just another arena where the scars of prejudice cut deeper than the papers on the judge's desk. She sat quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the chill of the room pressing against her skin. Around her, whispers floated like smoke, low enough not to be called out, but sharp enough to pierce her heart. They weren't whispers about the divorce itself. They weren't about the years she had struggled to hold a marriage together. They were about her. Her skin. Her presence. Her place in that courtroom, as though she were an intruder in her own story. Some leaned in, shaking their heads with pity. Others smirked, as if entertained by her humiliation. And then, he arrived. Her husband, or soon-to-be former husband, strode in with a confidence that seemed to command the space. He didn't hide his disdain, it radiated from him in every glance, every gesture, every cruel little smile. He didn't just want freedom from the marriage. He wanted her broken, diminished, erased. When he signed the divorce papers, he did it with exaggerated flourish, pausing just long enough to shoot her a look of mockery. To him, this wasn't paperwork. It was performance. Each stroke of the pen was meant to say, you are nothing, and without me, you will remain nothing. The laughter started small, just a few chuckles from the row behind him. But in moments, it spread. A sound that had no place in a courtroom filled the air, echoing louder than the judge's gavel. She felt her stomach tighten, her breath catch in her throat. She had endured years of this kind of humiliation in private. But now, it was public. Now, strangers were invited to join in. Still, she did not look away. She sat straight, her gaze fixed ahead, her silence stronger than any words she could have spoken. But silence, in that moment, felt like isolation. And the more the laughter grew, the more she wondered if anyone in that room would see her not as a spectacle, not as a stereotype, but as a human being. The judge tapped his gavel, urging the courtroom back to order. But the damage had been done. The smirk on her husband's face lingered like a scar. He believed he had won, not just the divorce, but the battle for dignity. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that hidden in a folded envelope resting in the judge's hands was a truth that would unravel everything. But that revelation was still to come. For now, All she had was the sting of injustice pressing against her ribs, and the weight of a world that had never allowed her to stand tall. Days turned into weeks, and even outside the courtroom, the whispers followed her. Friends she thought she could count on avoided her eyes. Acquaintances murmured behind her back, "She lost everything, she'll never recover." Employers questioned her stability. The divorce wasn't just a personal ending. It became a public label, a scarlet letter that seemed to cling to her in every space she entered. And the cruelest part? Her husband seemed to thrive on it. He spread his version of the story, painting himself as the noble one who had endured a difficult marriage with patience, while portraying her as bitter, ungrateful, and undeserving. In gatherings, he let the lies slip like poison into ears eager to believe. In neighborhoods, he carried himself like the victor of a war. It wasn't just betrayal, it was erasure. Piece by piece, he was stripping away her reputation, her history, her dignity. And in a world already stacked against her because of the color of her skin, his lies found easy soil to take root. People didn't need much convincing to look down on her. They already had their reasons. He simply watered the prejudice that was already there. Yet beneath the weight of humiliation, something began to stir inside her. She had survived too much in life to let this be her ending. Every mocking smile, every whispered insult, every moment of cold dismissal added fuel to a fire she had almost forgotten she carried. A fire that told her, "There is more to you than this. There is a truth they cannot silence forever." But the path to that truth was not easy. She discovered things her husband had kept hidden, financial manipulations, debts in her name, attempts to cut her off from what rightfully belonged to her family. He wasn't satisfied with freedom, he wanted her empty-handed, powerless, a shadow left to vanish quietly. And then, the letter arrived. It was not addressed to her, but to the court. A sealed envelope, marked with the name of her late father. For months, she had wondered if his affairs had been settled, if anything remained of his legacy. Now, suddenly, here it was, time to land right in the middle of the divorce proceedings. The judge held it carefully, as though aware that its weight carried more than just paper. The courtroom fell into silence when he announced it. Even her husband, with all his arrogance, leaned forward, curiosity breaking through his smirk. But before the seal was broken, before the truth inside could be revealed, the judge adjourned the session. The will would be read in full at the next hearing. Her heart pounded. For the first time in years, she felt a sliver of hope, but also a rush of fear. Because whatever that envelope held, it had the power to shift everything. And in a world where justice was rarely on her side, she couldn't help but wonder, would this be the moment she finally stood tall, or the moment the system found a new way to strip her down? She walked out of the courthouse with heads turning toward her, whispers chasing her steps. Her husband strutted behind her, confident that even this twist would somehow fall in his favor. And as the sun sank low, casting shadows across the pavement, she realized she was standing on the edge of a storm that could either destroy her completely, or reveal a strength that no prejudice, no cruelty, no mockery could ever erase. And deep inside, she knew, the worst was yet to come. The day of the final hearing arrived like a storm that no one could outrun. The courthouse steps, usually quiet and unremarkable, seemed alive with a restless energy. Reporters hovered outside, sensing a story bigger than paperwork. Neighbors who once whispered behind closed doors now pressed forward, curious to see what spectacle might unfold. And at the center of it all, she walked steadily, her hands trembling only slightly as she clutched her bag. Her husband was already there, standing tall, his arrogance sharpened to a blade. He greeted those who nodded in his direction, smiling as though he were a man attending a celebration rather than a reckoning. His confidence was unnerving, almost infectious. He had convinced himself, and many others, that today would be his final victory. Today, she would walk away diminished, humiliated, forgotten. The courtroom filled quickly. Every seat was taken, the air thick with anticipation. As she entered, heads turned. Some eyes were curious, others cold, but too many carried that familiar look, a look that judged her not by her character, not by her years of resilience, but by the color of her skin. She had felt it all her life, that quiet dismissal, that unspoken prejudice. And now, in this moment, it seemed to pulse stronger than ever. The judge arrived, gavel in hand. Silence fell, though it was the kind of silence that carried weight, heavy and suffocating. On the table lay the envelope, her father's will, its seal still unbroken, its truth waiting like a thunderclap behind a closed door. Her heart raced. She tried to steady her breath, to focus on the rhythm of inhale and exhale, but her mind flooded with questions. What had her father left behind? Would it be enough to reclaim her dignity? Or would this final hope collapse like so many before it, leaving her stripped of everything? The proceedings began. Lawyers spoke in sharp tones, each word meant to slice the air. Her husband's attorney painted a picture of a woman undeserving, unstable, unworthy of support. He twisted her silence into weakness, her resilience into stubbornness, her very identity into a liability. And then came the smirk. Her husband, seated only a few feet away, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes fixed on her with the same mocking stare he had carried since the day he signed the divorce papers. It wasn't enough for him to win. He wanted her destroyed. The judge cleared his throat and lifted the envelope. The room tensed. Even the whispers faded into stillness. With slow precision, the seal was broken, the paper unfolded, and the words of her late father filled the air. At first, the details seemed ordinary, legal language, acknowledgments of debt settled, small assets distributed. But then, the tone shifted. Her father had spoken not just as a man dividing property, but as a father preserving dignity. He named her directly, not with a token, not with scraps, but with the bulk of his estate. Land. Property. Savings. Enough not only to free her from debt, but to place her far above the reach of those who mocked her. The courtroom gasped. Heads turned. Eyes widened. For years, she had been dismissed as powerless, dependent, voiceless. And now, in black ink, her father's words shattered that illusion. She was not the abandoned, diminished woman her husband portrayed. She was the heir. She was the one holding strength no one expected her to have. But before relief could wash over her, before hope could settle in, her husband erupted. He slammed his hand on the table, his voice cutting through the air. He accused her of manipulation, of deceit, of tricking the court. He demanded investigations, claiming the will was fraudulent. His rage was raw, almost feral, as though the truth had stolen something from him he believed was rightfully his. The judge pounded the gavel, demanding order, but chaos had already spilled into the room. Some in the crowd shouted in her defense, while others sneered, repeating ugly words that stung like open wounds. She sat frozen, the papers trembling in her hands. For so long, she had dreamed of a moment like this, a moment where truth would vindicate her. Yet here she was, still surrounded by voices determined to strip her dignity, still trapped in a room where even justice seemed fragile. Her husband turned toward her, his eyes burning with hatred. And in that look was every insult, every dismissal, every moment of cruelty he had ever inflicted. He wanted her broken more than he wanted freedom. And he would not stop, not here, not now, not ever, unless something greater than his hate intervened. The judge, weary but firm, declared the will valid. The estate was hers. The legal authority was final. But the victory felt fragile, almost hollow, because the room did not celebrate her justice. It seethed against it. She rose slowly, her knees trembling, her chest tight. The weight of years pressed down, mingling with the eyes that refused to see her as more than the color of her skin. And yet, somewhere beneath the fear, a fire flickered. This was not just about property. This was not just about her. This was about every woman who had been silenced, every black voice dismissed, every dignity mocked in public and in private. The courtroom erupted again, voices colliding, emotion spilling, the gavel striking wood to no avail. And in that storm of sound, she realized, this was her turning point. She could shrink beneath the weight of prejudice, or she could stand, even if her voice shook, even if the world refused to listen. The judge's final words echoed through the chamber, this court recognizes her full inheritance, as outlined by her father's will. Case closed. The gavel struck one last time. But the story was not closed. Not yet. As she gathered her papers, her husband's voice cut through the noise, low but venomous, promising that this wasn't over. His words were not just a threat to her future, but a reminder of how deeply rooted injustice could be. And as she walked out of the courtroom, the cameras flashing, the crowd pressing, the question hung heavy in the air. Would this victory finally free her, or would it ignite a backlash that no inheritance could shield her from? When the courtroom finally emptied, she stood for a long moment at the top of the courthouse steps, clutching the papers that now bore her father's words. The crowd buzzed around her, reporters shouting questions, strangers leaning in to snap photos, whispers that carried both envy and disdain. She felt the weight of it all pressing on her shoulders. Yes, she had won. On paper, she now held property, land, and the resources her father had entrusted to her. But the victory didn't erase the sting of every laugh, every sneer, every insult that had been hurled in that courtroom. Justice had spoken, but prejudice had not been silenced. And that was the bitter truth she carried with her as she descended those steps. In the days that followed, her life shifted in ways she hadn't expected. There were people who reached out with congratulations, some genuinely moved by the strength she had shown. But there were just as many who resented her, who whispered that she hadn't earned it, who insisted that her father's decision was a mistake. Even in victory, the color of her skin became the lens through which her worth was measured. She found herself walking through familiar streets with unfamiliar eyes staring back at her. Not long ago, she had been invisible, dismissed, easy to ignore. Now, she was unavoidable, an example, a reminder, a symbol that unsettled those who preferred their world unchanged. Her inheritance didn't just give her financial power, it gave her visibility. And visibility, in a society built on inequality, was its own kind of danger. But alongside the fear, something else grew inside her, resolve. For years she had endured in silence, believing that dignity meant suffering quietly. The courtroom taught her otherwise. Dignity was not silence, it was standing when the world expected you to bow. It was claiming space when others tried to erase you. It was holding your head high, even when mockery roared in your ears. Her story became more than her own. Other women, neighbors, co-workers, even strangers, began sharing their experiences with her. Some had endured discrimination in workplaces, others in schools, others within their own families. They saw in her something they had longed for themselves. Proof that even in the face of cruelty, resilience could prevail. And yet, the reality was sobering. For every one story like hers that ended with a measure of justice, there were countless others that ended in silence, in loss, in despair. For every courtroom that upheld the truth, there were many more where prejudice bent the scales. Her victory was not the norm, it was the exception. And that truth weighed heavily on her. She thought often of her father, of why he had chosen to word his will so carefully. Perhaps he had known the world his daughter lived in. Perhaps he had seen how fragile dignity could be in the face of systemic injustice. Perhaps his final act was not just an inheritance, but a shield, a way to ensure that even when the world mocked her, she would have something no one could take away. Still, she asked herself, why did it take a legal document, a will written by a man no longer alive, to force others to see her value? Why wasn't her humanity enough? Why wasn't her life, her labor, her resilience reason enough for respect? These questions followed her everywhere. They were not just her questions, they were the questions of millions whose worth is constantly measured against prejudice, whose dignity is conditional, whose humanity is negotiable in the eyes of others. And that is the impact of her story. It is not simply the tale of a divorce, or a will, or a courtroom battle. It is a reflection of a deeper truth, that racism doesn't end with a gavel, and dignity cannot be handed out by a court. Racism thrives in whispers, in stares, in smirks, in the way a laugh can carry louder than justice itself. Her story forces us to ask, how many times will dignity be mocked before it is respected? How many lives will be diminished before equality is more than just a promise on paper? For her, the will changed her circumstances. It gave her tools, resources, a foundation to stand taller. But what about those who never receive such a chance? What about the ones who are mocked, humiliated, dismissed, and left with nothing to protect them. This is why her story matters. Because it shows both the fragility and the possibility of justice. It reminds us that behind every headline, every courtroom case, every statistic, there is a human being carrying wounds that no settlement can heal. And it asks you, to look deeper. To see the ways racism hides in plain sight. To recognize that justice is not truly justice if it comes only after humiliation, only after suffering, only after endurance that should never have been required in the first place. So as we close her story, remember this: her victory was real, but incomplete. It was powerful, but painful. It was hers, but it belonged to all who fight for dignity in a world too quick to dismiss them. The question is not whether she won in court. The question is, when will dignity no longer need a courtroom to be recognized? And until that day comes, how many more lives will carry the weight of injustice before we finally choose to listen, to change, to act?